Listen to my story. This may be our last chance.
I want to share a story with you about how I got into game modding and hacking, particularly with Final Fantasy X. From playing my first games as a kid to reverse engineering them just to make mods and tools, it's a journey that I think is worth sharing. Specifically, you might be curious about what drives someone who spent hours working on complex projects like turning the Steam version into an actual HD remaster without blurry textures, making a battle editor, gameplay mod, and hacking tools. Let me take you through the highs and lows of my experiences, from excitement to overwhelm, and eventually stepping back from the scene. It's difficult to remember times and dates with precision because I was just a child, but it was the early 2000s when my gaming journey began. At around 8 years old, I received 2 games that would start it all: Pokémon Crystal on my Game Boy Color and Final Fantasy VIII on my PlayStation 1. While Pokémon's simplicity was perfect for a young player like me, I struggled with Final Fantasy VIII's complex junctioning system. Thankfully, as I grew older and gained more guidance from adults, I gradually developed a deeper understanding of the game's mechanics. Each time I started a new playthrough, I'd make progress toward the end, but always seemed to hit a roadblock. It wasn't until my early teenage years that I finally defeated Ultimecia, the final boss of Final Fantasy VIII. What struck me about this game was its rich and detailed story, combined with innovative gameplay mechanics that were deeply intertwined. This caught my attention in a way that no other game had before. But what really piqued my interest wasn't just the sheer number of other Final Fantasy games out there, but the promise that each one offered something unique and new. I upgraded to a PlayStation 2 and received Final Fantasy XII. The moment I saw the flying airships in the main menu cutscene, Balamb was the first thing that came to mind. But as I started a new game, I quickly realized that none of the characters from Final Fantasy VIII were featured, a disappointment, especially given my fondness for those games. However, as I delved deeper into Final Fantasy XII's graphics and innovative battle mechanics, I began to appreciate the game on its own terms. Like with Final Fantasy VIII before it, I found myself playing through Final Fantasy XII multiple times, each playthrough bringing me closer to the end. It wasn't until my late teens that I finally defeated Vayne, the final boss. My experience with Final Fantasy XII's Gambit system sparked my initial thoughts about modding and hacking games. The logical progression went something like this. If I could customize the automatic actions of my characters using the Gambit system, why couldn't I also change or customize the default actions that enemies have? This simple idea started me thinking about how game mechanics might be tweaked or modified, a notion that would eventually lead me to explore game modding and hacking in more depth. Although I never took it that far in Final Fantasy XII, another game was catching my attention online. Final Fantasy X was being consistently praised by fans, and I had yet to give it a try. I'll admit it, when I first heard people raving about how amazing Final Fantasy X was, my initial reaction was skepticism. I thought they were just being nostalgic for the game, but everyone seemed to be saying the same thing. So, I decided to give it a try and see what all the fuss was about. And honestly, I was blown away. Coming from the games like Final Fantasy VIII and XII, as well as other non-Final Fantasy titles that I'd played, Final Fantasy X really felt like a step up in terms of game design. For me, it was one of those rare games where everything came together to create an amazing experience. But let's get back on track. This isn't about me praising or bashing individual games, but rather sharing my own story and what led me down the path I'm on. If you've been paying attention, you might have noticed one detail about how I got into video games. While I played Pokémon Crystal, Final Fantasy VIII, and XII just for the fun of it, I specifically chose to play Final Fantasy X because everyone was raving about it. And I'm glad I made that decision. It's definitely a game I won't forget. As I delved into Final Fantasy X, I found myself wanting more than just playing through the story once. I wanted to know every detail, from the subtle plot twists to the optional cutscenes and bosses. So, naturally, I started watching YouTube videos, reading guides, and trying to learn as much as I could about the game. And that's when I stumbled upon save editors and cheat codes for the PlayStation 2 version of Final Fantasy X. They were still a relatively new thing at the time. At first, it was just curiosity and a desire to explore more of the game, but soon I started digging deeper into the debug rooms and hidden features, like the enemy control mode. I also began experimenting with Cheat Engine and other tools, wondering what secrets lay hidden within the game. I'll keep this part brief, as we're not going into technical details here. Let's just say that I spent countless hours over several years trying to understand how Final Fantasy X works internally, mostly through trial and error using tools like Cheat Engine. It wasn't a daily or yearly commitment, but rather something I did sporadically over time. When the HD remaster was released on Steam, I started wondering if it was worth investigating further, since I'd already learned so much about the PlayStation 2 version. So, I took a closer look at the Steam version and discovered that most of what I knew still applied. The underlying code was identical to the PlayStation 2 version. It turns out that the Steam version just had better graphics and music, but everything else was pretty much the same. This discovery gave me a huge relief. All my work on the PlayStation 2 version wasn't for nothing. I could actually use what I'd learned and apply it to modding and hacking the Steam version without having to start from scratch. Now, I want to talk about how I started thinking about building Final Fantasy X projects and sharing them with others online. As you've heard me explain before, I'd been working on this stuff entirely on my own for years, without ever considering that other people might be interested in what I was doing. But one event stood out as a turning point for me. On my old YouTube channel, which was dedicated to hacking the PlayStation 2 version of Final Fantasy X, someone left a comment asking about using the hidden enemy control mode. The catch was that they were playing the Italian release of the game, while I was working with the English and Spanish releases, so they needed help converting cheat codes. I was able to provide them with the necessary codes, and it was great to see how happy they were when they finally got it working. They even sent me a screenshot as a thank you, which made my day. That interaction made me think, maybe there are other people out there who would be interested in what I'm doing. Around that time, I started checking out the online community for Final Fantasy modders, specifically nexusmods.com, where they were sharing texture mods and other projects for various games, including some Final Fantasy XII stuff. When I saw a few people uploading small texture mods for Final Fantasy X, I decided to create an account on the site and start sharing my own Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy XII projects. Let me give you a quick rundown on the Final Fantasy X and XII projects I worked on. The most popular mods I made for both games were my re-remaster mods, which involved upscaling all the textures and visual assets to make them look even better. To achieve this, I used AI image upscaling models, which required a significant amount of processing power. Each time I released an updated version of these mods, it would take my GPU over 100 hours to process the images. On top of that, I had to spend a ton of time extracting the textures from the game, converting them into a normal format for the upscaler model, and then converting the upscaled images back to the game's own texture format. And let me tell you, it was no small feat getting everything to work together smoothly. But despite all the hard work, people really responded well to these mods, and I'm glad they enjoyed them. The success of my re-remaster mod for Final Fantasy X was so great that I decided to create separate versions for Final Fantasy X-2 and Final Fantasy XII. While each game presented its own unique challenges, my approach to creating the mods differed slightly depending on the title. For example, my work on Final Fantasy XII involved 5 different types of graphics, with 2 sizes available for each type, resulting in a total of 10 files that required me to update all of them when making changes. In contrast, I took a more streamlined approach for Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy X-2 by combining graphic assets into single files, resulting in 3 files per game. My other projects for Final Fantasy XII were relatively minor compared to my work on Final Fantasy X. They were mostly small tools and mods aimed at making players' lives easier in various ways. For Final Fantasy X, I had a few completed projects that I continued to update over time, as well as some ideas that never quite came to fruition due to time constraints. Another standout project was the Final Summoning, a gameplay mod that included a battle editor and helped make the game more enjoyable. However, since I've already covered this topic in detail elsewhere on my channel, I won't go into too much depth about the final summoning here. Instead, if you're interested, you can check out the dedicated video about it on this YouTube channel. In addition to the Remaster mod and the final summoning, I also completed 3 other projects that were designed to make modding easier for others. These tools are not hacks or mods themselves, but rather useful resources that can be used to create new content. The first is an auto ability editor, which allows users to customize the various abilities that weapons and armor can have in the game. This includes creating entirely new, unique auto abilities from scratch. The second tool is an enemy action replacer, which enables players to swap out any action performed by any enemy in the game with a different one. For example, you could change a boss's signature attack into a completely different attack from a different enemy. Lastly, there's a general-purpose enemy editor that allows users to edit all sorts of enemy stats, including elemental affinities, status resistances, and auto statuses. One thing I want to quickly mention is that, at first, my mod tools were made using large batch files, bat scripts, in conjunction with text files. Modders would modify the text files with their desired configurations or parameters and then run the script file, which would read the configurations/parameters and patch them into the game files on a separate folder. However, this approach proved to be quite tedious for modders, especially given that the MS-DOS interpreter in modern Windows versions is notoriously slow. Even though I regularly updated the scripts to improve their performance, it still took a long time to run them. It was clear that there had to be a better way. I decided to take a more realistic approach, learn programming basics, and create user-friendly, visual interfaces for my tools. This was a major step forward in terms of ease of use and efficiency. Looking back on those early days, I'm amazed by how far I've come, especially considering that I was able to create functional game modding tools using nothing but MS-DOS scripts and text files. It's a clear reflection of what you can accomplish with determination and creativity. For me, the experience of making mod tools from scratch is one of my proudest achievements, along with the Final Fantasy X gameplay mod that I created. Both of these projects far exceeded my initial expectations and have given me a sense of fulfillment that I still enjoy today. It wasn't long before I hit a wall. I had too many projects to keep track of, each with its own set of bug fixes and improvements waiting to be addressed. At the same time, I was juggling multiple incomplete projects that were still in development, but not making progress as quickly as I'd like. To make matters worse, my personal life was also becoming increasingly overwhelming. To top it all off, I was dealing with a constant stream of requests from people asking for help with installing my mods or using my tools, despite the clear instructions I had published online. And if that wasn't enough, I would often get messages from individuals who wanted to learn how to make their own mods and hacks for Final Fantasy X. But when I tried to explain the basics to them, they'd lose interest or claim it was too complicated. I felt overwhelmed by the demands of my projects and the constant requests for help. I knew I needed to take a step back and refocus on what mattered most. At one point, I hit a breaking point and questioned whether it was worth continuing or calling it quits. On the one hand, I had seen firsthand that my projects were making a positive impact on people's lives. They enabled fans of Final Fantasy X to experience the game in new and exciting ways, taking full advantage of its possibilities. On the other hand, the demands on me were mounting. I had a massive to-do list of bug fixes and improvements, not to mention the constant barrage of questions from people who didn't bother reading my instructions or asking politely for help. And then there were those who became increasingly entitled and demanding, asking me to share my knowledge and resources with them. It was a tough spot to be in, and I have to admit that I was starting to feel hopeless. Despite still not making up my mind about what to do, I found myself leaning more towards the idea of stopping altogether. Before making my final decision, I had a shocking encounter on Nexus Mods. I discovered that my account and all my mods had been deleted from the site. Initially, I was furious, wondering why this had happened and feeling frustrated that all my hard work was gone. But as I reflected on the situation, another emotion emerged: relief. Having my projects removed meant I no longer had to deal with the constant demands and obligations that came with being a modder. It felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I realized that my passion for Final Fantasy X had turned into an all-consuming obligation. The thought of sacrificing myself for the sake of making a few dozen players happy was no longer appealing to me. In fact, it seemed futile and unsustainable. At this point, I had two options. Option A, continue modding on Nexus Mods or another platform, and Option B, quit the modding scene altogether. Given my growing sense of burnout and exhaustion, I knew that quitting was the right choice for me. So, I made a firm decision to leave the scene behind and prioritize my own well-being and peace of mind. Looking back now, I can see that this decision was the best one for me. It allowed me to break free from the cycle of obligation and exhaustion that had been suffocating me. Even after I'd made my decision to quit modding clear, I still get approached by people asking me to come back or join a modding community. And when they do, I not only reject their requests but also investigate the nature of these communities. Unfortunately, so far every time it turns out that they're just small groups of enthusiasts discussing basic, beginner-level topics, like the debug rooms and hidden enemy control mode that I mentioned at the beginning of my hacking journey. They make grand claims about working on large-scale projects, but in reality, they're just rehashing old discoveries or making outlandish theories about the game's mechanics. Take, for example, someone claiming that weapons from human enemies were originally intended to be enemies on their own, allowing players to break their weapons or some other similar gimmick. Sounds outlandish, right? But the actual explanation is much simpler. Enemies in Final Fantasy games, at least up to Final Fantasy XII, can't use equipment by design, and they can't display two separate 3D models. One 3D model usually corresponds to the human enemy itself, while another is just the weapon that this enemy is supposed to have. How do Final Fantasy games solve this exception to the rule? They use a placeholder enemy with the model of the weapon to make it visible on screen. For this reason, if you try to hack the human enemy alone, their weapon is entirely missing. This is similar to how the summon Yojimbo has a dog, Daigoro. When used by the player, Yojimbo has Daigoro equipped as his weapon. However, when battled as an enemy, Daigoro is a separate enemy that can't be attacked or interacted with in any way. In other words, the enemy Yojimbo doesn't have equipment, and Daigoro is an entirely separate enemy. While it could seem realistic to theorize that Daigoro could have been an enemy of its own, the rifles and flamethrowers from the various monk enemies in the game were clearly not meant to be attacked in any way, only making for an absurd theory from doing ridiculous mental gymnastics. Instead of putting two and two together, they make up an overcomplicated and nonsensical solution, and this in itself already shows that they are on the very early steps of hacking a Final Fantasy game. It's not rocket science, and pretending that they just discovered rocket science changes nothing. Before finishing this video, I would like to make a couple of recommendations. If you are interested in Final Fantasy modding, hacking, glitches and other unusual stuff, feel free to take a look around my YouTube channel. And if you're not interested or have already seen my videos, I would like to recommend another gaming YouTube channel that I really enjoy. Their name is NGPlus, and specifically, I think you should check out their video called "Can You Beat Final Fantasy VIII Without Junctioning?" which will be linked in the description and hopefully appearing on screen right now. Thanks for watching, and feel free to leave a comment with your thoughts or any feedback you'd like to share.